Welcome to Postcards from Texas. I'm Mike Vance. This week we'll check out sulfur mining along the Texas coast, and we'll visit the most beautiful house in Galveston. But first, Felix and Angie Morales left a lasting legacy for Houston's East End.
They married and then they came to Houston with a borrowed hearse and like $100 and started a business. His brother helped him out and he was the one who lent him the money and gave him the hearse and got him off the ground.
They rose from that humble start.
That's a whole nother long story, but Mary Martinez and my grandmother and Angelina Morales were the best of friends. And she said we were right next door to them and we were so poor we borrowed their electricity. They gave us a cord and we would turn our lights on. I believe that when they moved to Houston in 1931, or around there, 1930, 1931, they rented or leased a home that they ran the funeral home out of. She told me that it wasn't until 1936 that they purchased 2901 Canal, where we have the funeral home now.
This funeral home was extremely important. It meant that we finally had a funeral home in our community that catered exclusively to the Mexican population.
Their best-known contribution is likely radio station KLVL, which went on the air on Cinco de Mayo, 1950.
She always talked about it took us 10 years to get KLVL off the ground and on the radio, on the air.
First Mexican-American radio station, also right in the heart of Second Ward, the Morales Funeral Home.
They were, and still are, on Canal Street, which are part of the Morales family, which they have the funeral home, then they had the radio station right next to it.
So it was extremely important, not only as a source of information, but as a source of entertainment.
Music from home satisfied a need among Mexican Americans.
It was a total monopoly and it was strictly Mexican music. You didn't hear Tejano music.
They would have these dances everywhere, you know, at the Pan American, Los Globos, you know, there was a lot of places. Even at bigger venues, I remember them talking about some places downtown, in downtown Houston, where they'd rent a big venue and then bring in a big artist.
Musical acts developed a close tie to the station.
My dad, you know, he would always bring these entertainers in and they would come to our house and we'd have these parties all the time. It was kind of a crazy childhood, but the person, or his dear friend, was a gentleman by the name of Mikey Laudy, and he ended up being my brother's godfather. I remember them talking about Antonio Aguilar and Flor Silvestre and you know, Vicente Fernandez and all, you know, all the big ones. And I even remember my dad talking about Elvis, because he used to do some things with the rodeo as well. And he's like, hey, I met Elvis when I went to the rodeo.
In the early days, Felix Morales himself appeared on the air.
My grandfather didn't do as much announcing either, but he loved to sing. And that was the whole idea behind him opening a radio station. He said that he wanted to be able to sing and he wanted to be able to play his records on the radio. Nobody else would play his records, so he'd have his own radio station and play his own music.
Some people say he started the station so he could sing on the air, but he was a feature of the broadcast many times.
And it's so funny, even today, like a couple of years ago, somebody was at the funeral home and they didn't know who I was yet. And a woman said, oh, I remember Mr. Morales. He couldn't sing worth a darn. And I was like, yeah, that was my grandpa. And she was so embarrassed. And I said, that's okay. We all knew he couldn't sing.
It was a family business. Christina recalls her dad on the air, too.
He was the best radio announcer at KLVL. He really is. And to this day, you know, I know that. He had such an awesome voice. He was so fluent in English and Spanish. And he just sounded great. Even to this day, women come up to me and say, oh, you know, your dad, he was just like a movie star to all of us. And I went out on a date with him, you know, and you could see the twinkle in their eye.
KLVL was one-stop shopping for advertisers.
It was a good thing for me when I started my business, because I don't have to spend any more money. I mean, every show that I bring to Houston, the only station that I have to spend money was KLVL. And the spot was very cheap at that time, $10, $5, $7, something like that. So you spend $2,000 with a big show, and everybody knows where you're going to be, and you don't have to spend more money.
Many community needs were addressed through the station.
So it was really the only way that immigrants, people who only spoke Spanish, would know what's going on in their community or back home, or anything that was going on. They would translate the news to them, everything. They could not only listen to the music that they were used to or accustomed to, but they could also know what was going on.
KLVL was the first radio station to broadcast Colt 45 games in Spanish.
They used to have programs, community programs also. I know there's one that always ran every morning, Necesito trabajo, I need work. And they would interview people that wanted to work, and people that wanted to hire them would call in. And it was sort of the first employment thing, you might want to say, of the community.
The station always tried to help.
My grandmother, she had a big heart, and she always wanted to help her community. She really and truly did. She started a program called Que Dios se lo pague, and people would call into the radio station and they would say, you know, this happened in my family, or this person got sick, or we just found out that somebody back home is ill or hurt or passed away, and we need some money to help with that. And it was such a tight-knit community, and they wanted to help each other, that people would actually send in the money or go and help the person in some way, or bring a donation of food or clothing or whatever the person needed. She went to church every day. She prayed every day. She did the rosary every day. And on KLVL, every day at noon, you knew everybody stopped and there was a little prayer, and then it'd go on.
That caring attitude is the real legacy of Felix and Angie Morales.
But Mr. Morales was very, very prominent in our community and helping our community quite a bit.
Felix Morales was a good friend of mine, real good friend of mine. He helped me a lot in my promotion when I started the business of bringing some group from Mexico. He helped me a lot with the station.
He was a contemporary. Felix Morales was a contemporary of John J. Herrera and Felix Tejerina, and formed part of the leadership core at that time.
Today, radio station KLVL is no longer the lone Spanish voice on the Houston airwaves.
There must be at least 15, 16 plus now, AM, FM, catering to all sorts of different groups. There's so many now that the proliferation of those radio stations is really interesting to see, in contrast to this one little station that was alone and the only station in Houston for so many years.
Up next, mining sulfur. In the late 1800s, most of the world's sulfur was mined by hand in Italy, but that was about to change.
The Texas Gulf Sulfur started finding sulfur mines, and where did they find them? Along salt domes.
Down here in Texas, we have these salt domes, which is a geological structure which has high concentrations of sulfur, natural gas, and oil. Most of the oil that's produced in this region comes from these salt domes.
A new mining technique brought those salt domes into play.
He took the money he made from that and he developed this method, which became known as the frost method of removing sulfur. What the method basically is, they take, and sulfur has a low melting point. So they use hot water, heat up water, pump it into the sulfur.
I find it kind of fascinating that they use basically a steam operation to extract it from the ground. They'd heat it up and bring it out in a kind of a liquid slurry, and then it would dry in these mountains of yellow cake, as they called it.
Sulfur operations sprung up all along the Texas and Louisiana coastal prairies.
And so it actually revived, like in Freeport and in Liberty County and Jefferson County. In fact, at Spindletop, of all places, they actually made more money off of the sulfur than they did the oil.
Freeport Sulfur was a major company, the forerunner of today's global giant, Freeport-McMoRan.
The first sulfur pour was in 1912, I believe. And there's great pictures of, it was one of those things, the whole town came out to look at the big sulfur block, and there's pictures of the women dressed in their Sunday finest and the children out there standing in front of these sulfur blocks just being dwarfed.
Those sulfur cakes could indeed be mind-bogglingly huge.
And these blocks of sulfur was literally as big as a city block. They were about 60 feet tall. And they would solidify into one giant block of sulfur, and then they would dynamite the blocks of sulfur to pulverize it and put it on trains, which took it to the shipping docks here.
They used barges on the Trinity, and of course they shipped it at Jefferson or Spindletop Field. They shipped it down the Sabine-Neches waterway. Oftentimes, though, they would actually use a liquid form and transport it by rail, sometimes by truck, depending what time period you're talking about. But the earliest times, they would fill up barges and go on the waterway because it is a bulk product.
Another profitable area company was Texas Gulf Sulphur.
One thing that was very interesting about the Texas Gulf Sulphur Company was the fact that they had company towns, and they were near the mine, and it was like they knew each other and knew the parents, and the parents knew the children. And, oh yeah, you know, we're down at Bowling, or we're at Freeport, and now we're in Liberty for a while, and Grandpa got a promotion, so we went back.
Eclipsing even Freeport sulfur in the size of operations was the Texas Gulf Mine at Bowling in Wharton County. That mine has produced more sulfur than anywhere else in the world. Area operations kept expanding.
It was to eventually go on to places like New Gulf down here, down the road, Bryan Mound, Hoskins Mounds, places which later became known also for oil production. About 80% of the world's sulfur came out of this area at one time. And of course, sulfur is still being produced here.
Elemental sulfur has many uses.
Of course, sulfur being a major component in many things, everything from dyes. The old RIT dyes had a high sulfur content. Pharmaceutical grade sulfur. They also use sulfur in the vulcanization of rubber, use sulfur in the refinery of steel, and agricultural grade sulfur, which one of the main components in most of your gardening products, which are used to kill fungus.
Oh, the big thing that it was used for was steel making, and that was of course in Pittsburgh and other places, but also in the Lone Star State. You know, you had some steel works at different places, including Houston.
Not to mention for the war effort, it was also used in munitions. One of the major components of gunpowder is sulfur.
And the companies were hugely important to many communities.
They provided new schools, they provided all kinds of employment from engineers to common laborers, and they were in many cases were the highest taxpayer in a county.
It was the big corporation down here before Dow Chemical came down.
But what about the smell?
And I've been to the sulfur plant that still exists. It's really, sulfur is a fairly inert substance, and as long as it doesn't get powdered and float around in the air and stuff, it really doesn't have that much of a significant smell to it. I guess you would suspect that the whole area would smell of rotten eggs, but it just doesn't.
Up next, the Bishop's Palace. Broadway in Galveston has been lined with fine mansions, and the finest may be the one known today as the Bishop's Palace.
Well, it started in 1859 with the construction of Ashton Villa by James Monroe Brown. And for whatever reason, he decided to put his mansion there on Broadway. And once he did, all the other millionaires here in Galveston had to have their house on Broadway too. There were a lot of grand houses here in Galveston, and this was one of the grandest, if not the grandest.
Architect Nicholas Clayton built the home for Colonel and Mrs. Walter Gresham.
Architecturally, I mean, he was the premier architect of Galveston. He was the best the island had, and if you wanted something grand or you wanted something done right, you usually went to Nicholas Clayton.
He was extremely talented in his ability to capture spatial settings and be able to really look at a building and see it in its site was something he was really a master at. He had a lot of very strong and very wealthy clients very early when he started working in Galveston. But he did an array of things. He did properties that were principal residences for people, and he did a number of tenant and secondary houses and buildings for people.
Colonel Gresham was an important man on the island.
Well, Mr. Gresham was a Virginian-born man, had been in the Civil War, came to Galveston after the war, met his wife Josephine. And Mr. Gresham was an attorney. He was prominent in the Santa Fe Railroad, which of course was headquartered here for most of its life. He had extensive investments across the country, and particularly in Texas and in Galveston. He was extremely well respected. He served in the Texas legislature, and he went to the U.S. House of Representatives for a term representing this area of Texas.
He got involved in the Port of Galveston. He was on the Deep Water Committee to get the port deepened. He lobbied Congress on behalf of the Port of Galveston, and that's a big reason why he was here too.
The Greshams monitored the process.
Colonel Gresham had an idea of what he wanted, and of course he took that to Nicholas Clayton, and Nicholas Clayton did come up with the designings, but everything had to be approved by either Colonel Gresham or his wife, Mrs. Gresham. When we found in Clayton's records that the east chimney, we're not sure which east chimney, but she said the east chimney was not to her liking, and it was actually torn down and they started over again.
Construction started in 1886.
Well, it took them, of course, 6 years for them to complete the house, and of course, it's all made out of limestone, sandstone, and granite. And from what we know, everything was cut here on site. He had artisans coming from all over the country, woodworkers, stonemasons, and of course, there's all kinds of different woods, the fireplaces themselves, a lot of hand carvings, both in wood and in stone and also in plaster. It was just a massive undertaking just because the house is so ornate. We're still uncovering a few things about the house as well. For instance, with the stairway, we do know that it was hand carved in Cincinnati and that it was then shipped to Galveston and then it was assembled here. But the shutters are really interesting because they're all interior here in the house, all interior shutters, and the neat thing about them is they actually, when you open them, they just fold back into the walls. And so if all the shutters in the house were open, you would never know that the house had shutters.
The style of the finished home is exquisitely Victorian.
It's not a Queen Anne, it's not one of the Italianates that are also sort of subsets of the Victorian period, but it's a very unusual composition. It's really a French, French eclectic, but we call it a chateau or chateauesque. It's different architectural historians call it different things. And it's much more similar to the work that Richard Morris Hunt was doing on the East Coast in New York and for the Vanderbilts, the big wealthy families of the late 19th century. And Clayton himself would describe this house, he would say, it's like the castles you would see in Germany or France. And he made that castle fit onto a very narrow, very confined urban site. We were told that he talked to the Greshams and he said, oh, you should build this house on the beach because it's going to be grand and beautiful and you need this big beach view and you'd have able to build gardens and things around it. And they said, no, we'd like for you to build it in town on this lot that we already own. So they moved the house that was here down the street, and he began to construct this piece here. So it's a huge house sort of pushed into an urban site. And when you get that, you look at it and you think, wow, this could be in a whole lot of other places where you really get a better sense of it. But somehow it really works here.
Mrs. Gresham oversaw the home closely.
She was actually had been born in Texas. She was from a well-respected family. She was an artist and was pretty accomplished in artistry. And one of the things we discovered in the raised basement underneath were these wonderful paintings that she did. She actually painted a grotto on the walls and on the things. So she created and used the raised basement of the Bishop's Palace or Gresham home in a way that most people of the age weren't doing.
Mrs. Gresham had this house decorated from floor to ceiling with all kinds of knickknacks and things that you would see today, just porcelain animals and pillows up the staircase and just a wide variety of paintings everywhere.
It was a busy household.
They had a large family, and two of the children died pretty young, and then the 7 that grew up and lived here, she had the daughters on the second floor and the sons on the top floor. And you can imagine a house like this with 2 adults and those children running around would have been quite a little wild place.
And as a family themselves, they would have had, 2 or 3 maids to keep the household running. We know there was a part-time gardener here at the house and a full-time cook. Family had a nanny and they had a governess and things of that nature. So they were just like any wealthy family here in Galveston. And we have stories kind of about the cook and how Mrs. Gresham ran a tight household and how the cook was coming in late and setting the clock back, and she found that out and put a lock over the clock so the cook couldn't do that anymore. That's why we know that a lot of the servants were off site.
The house survived the Great Storm of 1900.
Considering the damage that was done around the house did extremely well during the 1900 hurricane. They said that they had about 6 feet of water in the basement, that they had about $300 worth of broken glass. Of course, that's a $1,900, and that also some of the seawater had sprayed in through the broken windows onto the parquet floors here in the house and caused them to warp and buckle. But other than that, the house was in fantastic shape.
The name the Bishop's Palace stems from later ownership by the Catholic Archdiocese.
Well, the church bought this house in 1923. Basically what happened is Colonel Gresham died in 1920, and after his death, Mrs. Gresham moved permanently to Washington, D.C.
The locals purchased the house from the Greshams and actually provided it to the bishop who was living in Galveston at the time, and hence its name, Bishop's Palace. And the bishop lived here through the 50s, and then there was sort of a period of less use, and then in the 60s the diocese, recognizing what an important property it was, decided to open it up to the public.
It's kind of interesting because Colonel Gresham paid $250,000 for this house, and the diocese got it in 1923 for $40,500 all total.
Today, the Galveston Historical Foundation oversees the property.
The good thing that the diocese did is it's still here. It's not a service station, a gas station, as some of the properties became on Broadway. And it's still a part of our community, and it's also a part of the state and the country because we're able to tell the story of the Gresham family, also the church, and also the work of Clayton and all the artisans who went into building this great masterpiece.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Postcards from Texas.
Mailman bring a postcard yesterday. Mailman bring a postcard yesterday. Set my baby up and gone away. She gone to